Hello and welcome to the College Football Focus. I'm Big Italy 42 here with Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL on Twitter. And we're talking about this main slate on Saturday, of course, as always, some top plays. And the top play here at quarterback, not going to surprise anyone, Trayvon Boykin. And you mentioned here how a lot of weeks he wouldn't be a guy you'd necessarily recommend because he's really tough to fit. But you think there's plenty of value to be able to get him in here this week.
Yeah, and we'll get to some of that value at the running back position in particular a little bit later. But right now we'll talk about Boykin. He is the number one overall quarterback on this slate, both price-wise and projection-wise. So TCU's playing Kansas in a bounce-back game where they lost last week against Oklahoma State. And in that loss, even though Boykin threw 4 interceptions, he still put up 37 fantasy points. So, I mean, if that tells you anything about his production week to week, I mean, I think he could put up 40 fantasy points at halftime against this Kansas team because obviously it should be a blowout. I don't know, that TCU defense has been pretty spotty, so maybe they'll give up a couple touchdowns to actually keep Boykin in the game into the third quarter. So either way, I really like Boykin. His star wide receiver, Josh Doxson, we've got some conflicting reports about him. He hurt his wrist last week, which really kind of hurt Boykin down the stretch without having his number one option. But Doxson is expected to play. I don't know how much. I believe that's an update from what I put in the article because earlier today he was out for the season. But then Gary Patterson, TCU's head coach, came out and said that he will play against Kansas. So that's the joy of college football. You get that kind of reporting and self-diagnosis. So we'll probably need to keep an eye on that developing situation. But, reading between the lines, Boykin is still a steady play, whether Doxson is in for majority of the snaps or not. I mean, even if Doxson's out, Boykin will probably just run the ball more. He has other weapons on the outside, so not much concern in this matchup.
Yeah, I mean, still a guy with huge floor, and I mean, maybe he'll just do even more if Doxson can't play much. Keenan Reynolds from Navy, you mentioned FanDuel only play, and he's the guy who obviously he runs a ton, doesn't pass nearly as much, but I mean, he's got huge upside rushing, which is almost even better for you as far as passing goes. Obviously, more points for rushing touchdowns, more points for rushing yards as opposed to passing yards. So $7,100 here. Is he a viable cash game option for you if you're not playing Boykin?
Yeah, I think he is. I mean, there's some concern that he hasn't been that great fantasy-wise over the past 2 weeks. But, I mean, Navy really didn't need him. It was the running back Swain who's been kind of taking some of that burden upon himself with 4 rushing touchdowns over the past 2 games. But, I mean, in this matchup against SMU, one of the worst rush defenses in the league, I believe quarterback Reynolds and the running back Swain could both get theirs, maybe 2 touchdowns apiece in this one. I mean, and we know that Reynolds has that 4-touchdown upside. I mean, it's just a matter if he calls his own number in the red zone or not. So for $7,100 on FanDuel, I think that's a great price point given that upside, and I'm willing to take a chance on him in a couple situations.
Yeah, I like that. And then Joe Huebner for Kansas State, $6,200 on FanDuel, $65 on DraftKings. And I feel like this is something we talk about almost every single week is the Texas Tech defense is awful. And especially when you can get a cheap quarterback who's been productive against them, seems like a perfect recipe for big upside.
Yeah, and if you look what Huebner's done in previous games that were high scoring against TCU and Baylor, I mean, he's been 150-plus yards, 2 touchdowns running, and then pair that with maybe 100, 150 yards and 1 or 2 touchdowns through the air, and you're looking at 35, 40 fantasy points for, almost half the price of a guy like Boykin. So I think he's cash game and tournament viable. Especially love him in tournaments there when you can kind of just slot him in at quarterback and then, build everything around him with that savings. So it's a great matchup for him. 6-point spread here. Texas Tech is favored at home, but should be a competitive, high-scoring affair, 71 over-under. And that price point, you just can't beat it on either site. So definitely a QB2 on DraftKings that I'll probably have in all of my cash games. And then maybe on FanDuel, some cash games, mix him in there, but definitely in playing tournaments as well.
All right, next up, a guy who outplayed Leonard Fournette last week, Derrick Henry from Alabama, $8,900 on FanDuel, $86 on DraftKings. Obviously, that was a much tougher matchup than what he's going to have this week. But, I mean, he's looked now like what Leonard Fournette looked like earlier in the season, almost like took that role over. And, I mean, he's got a really, really high ceiling and a really high floor here.
Yeah, and I mean, you have to just consider that LSU was a top 10 rushing defense heading into last week, and now they're 15th overall. So Derrick Henry kind of bumped them down almost 10 spots all by himself. He was just that good last week. And now he has 7 touchdowns the past 3 games. I mean, it's going to be hard-pressed for him not to get in the end zone at least a couple times against Mississippi State, who ranks kind of middle of the pack in rushing defense. I believe they're 65th overall in the country, which is not that great considering an SEC defense. So you have to like Derrick Henry. The price hasn't really risen too much on both sites, or basically at all. I think maybe $200-$300 is all it really rose on FanDuel. So I mean, I think he's one of the top overall plays at running back in this early slate. You could also make an argument for Ezekiel Elliott, kind of right at the same price point. I think he's $9,100 on FanDuel, $8,400 on DraftKings. But with JT Barrett coming back, there's just a lot of different ways that Ohio State offense could go. Especially, Barrett runs the ball pretty effectively. He could siphon some of the goal line attempts away from Elliott. So that's why I'm leaning towards Henry while paying up. I think he's just is a lot safer in that regard, that he is going to get all those goal line carries.
Yeah, and I appreciate the Ohio State respect there. So I'll give you some Nebraska. Congratulations on that win last week.
Hey, thanks.
Asterisks, but whatever.
I can finally wear this shirt and actually feel good about it, so I'm definitely going to take advantage of it and go ahead and wear it on this podcast. So.
Is this the first day you've worn it, or have you been wearing it all week?
I've been wearing it every game up until this point, so if that counts.
So it's about what, 4-3 as a shirt this year?
I think that's being a little bit generous, actually.
All right. Either way, that was still a big win, and I appreciate it as a Buckeye fan. Wayne Gallman from Clemson, $7,200 on FanDuel, $65 on DraftKings. And you mentioned here he's done well against some quality opponents, especially Florida State last week. And now he gets Syracuse, who every year they're one of those teams that isn't horrible, but they're not really any good at anything. Since Donovan McNabb, really, this team has just not been good.
Yeah, and, they rank 84th in the nation in rushing defense, and I actually think they're quite a bit worse than that. I mean, every time they played good competition, they got toasted by Leonard Fournette, but then again, who doesn't? And then Patrick, that freshman running back from Florida State, ran all over them as he was filling in for Dalvin Cook. So Wayne Gallman has it going, 100-plus yards in 6 of the past 7 games. As you mentioned, 135 total yards last week and a touchdown against Florida State. Clemson, they should just be cruising in this one, running the ball deep into the game. And I'm expecting Gallman to have 100-plus, maybe 150 yards and 2 touchdowns in this one. So very targetable on both sides.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Jovan Robinson from Auburn, you mentioned here. Peyton Barber was the guy who was the focal point here a couple weeks ago. And now it's kind of, as you mentioned, tipping back towards Jovan Robinson. And that's a good thing if you're looking for value, because he's only $5,000 on FanDuel and $4,700 on DraftKings.
Yeah, and this is kind of crazy. There's a ton of value in that spot. I think Robinson's maybe one of the better ones, but there's a lot of different ways you can go with these near minimum, or at least on FanDuel, near minimum running back plays. So you have Jovan Robinson, who had 27 carries, 59 yards last week at Texas A&M. I mean, if he sees those carries again, which I envision he will, as Auburn tries to ride the hot hand, he could be in for another pretty fair stat line against Georgia this week. But then again, you have Holmes of Michigan State. He's their starting running back, took over last week, had 111 yards and a touchdown against Nebraska. Now he has a very favorable matchup, I believe, against Maryland. Yeah, against Maryland, who's one of the worst rushing defenses in the Big Ten. So a little bit of upside there. He's similarly priced at $5K. And then you have Adams of Notre Dame. We'll need to keep an eye on the injury situation for this one. Procise, their usual starter, their star running back, had a concussion last week, left early. Adams had 20 carries, 140 yards, and a receiving touchdown in his place. So if Procise is out, I think Adams is a fine play. He's 6.3K on FanDuel. And then you have, as I mentioned earlier, Swain of Navy, who's been kind of taking most of that rushing game on his shoulders. 4 touchdowns in the past 2 weeks. I mean, this SMU defense, as I said earlier, pretty terrible. I think him and Keenan Reynolds could both get it going. So I like that call as well. And then the final cheap play, there's a lot of them. Like I said, Charles Jones of Kansas State is 4.7K on FanDuel, even less on DraftKings. And he's their main running back there for Kansas State, playing this horrible Texas Tech run defense. The only drawback is that their quarterback Hubner sometimes gets the goal line carries, which he may not get into the end zone as much, but there will be a lot of attempts for him, a lot of chances for him to get into the end zone, and maybe get 20-plus carries, go over 100 yards as well. So keep an eye on him.
Yeah, lots of value plays there. So take notes, get those down. Wide receiver, this guy not a value play necessarily, but price probably lower than he should be. William Fuller from Notre Dame had a huge game last week, a lot of it in the first half even, 7 for 152 and 3 touchdowns. And, with Josh Doctson being banged up, maybe he plays, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's never going to play again. Nobody really knows. William Fuller seems like he's probably your best option up top.
Yeah, I said he has the safest combination of floor, upside, and price within this slate. And as I said a little bit ago, their running back Procise is beat up. Even if he plays, he may not get all the carries he's used to. So maybe that'll shift some of the focus to the passing game. And, I mean, even the short passing game, Fuller can eat up in that regard. This is a nice matchup against Wake Forest. Fuller should overmatch any cornerback that's trying to guard him. And I think he's an obvious top play, and he's pretty easy to squeeze in there with all that value that I mentioned at the running back spot. So I would just pencil him in and then kind of work around that.
Makes a lot of sense there. Aaron Burbridge from Michigan State, 7,500 on FanDuel, 7,200 on DraftKings. And you mentioned Michigan State, not a pass-first offense, but when they have to, Connor Cook, still one of the better in the country at getting the ball downfield. And Burbridge has already had a couple really big games here.
Yeah, and he has 37 receptions over the past 4 games, which, I mean, that's close to 10 receptions a game. And he could get there again. This Maryland defense is not good. And just looking at the Vegas line, I mean, Michigan State's not expected to blow them out. That's a 15-point spread. So even considering they're up 2 touchdowns, they'll still be throwing the ball every now and then to, kind of sustain drives and run out the clock in the second half. So I like Burbridge to kind of stay where he has been, around that 20 fantasy point threshold. And I think you can click him in and Fuller and still have a pretty good lineup around that, given that there is a ton of value at running back this week.
Yeah, I'll definitely be taking advantage of that. Kevontae Turpin from TCU. We mentioned Josh Doctson a couple times already here. He's only $5,200, $5,000 on DraftKings. Obviously, with his huge favorite, someone's going to need to catch the ball, and maybe Doctson is a guy who doesn't see a big workload this week. And Turpin at really cheap price. I mean, we've seen him have a couple solid games as well, and maybe he's just more heavily involved this week with Doctson banged up.
Yeah, and it just doesn't seem like Doctson should be playing much in this game. I mean, they're 45-point favorites against Kansas. It doesn't make sense for them to try and press him out there. So Turpin has kind of filled into his shoes over the past 2 games, catching 7 passes apiece in those. And, he could get some garbage time, too, because he is part of the second unit that could stay out there as TCU's pulling away in the second half. So maybe he can break a big one. We saw it earlier this season. He had 4 touchdowns in 1 game. He's just one of those players. And within this offense, this high-powered offense against a bad opponent, there's a chance he could break one. And, seeing him a little more involved over the past 2 weeks just kind of brings about a little more confidence than usual. So I think he's kind of a sneaky mid-range, lower mid-range pick right within that.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Any other wide receivers you want to mention?
Yeah, I got a couple more. Chesson, I don't know exactly how to say it, but it's spelled like that, so that's what the pronunciation I'm going to go with. He's of Michigan. He's caught a touchdown in, I think, 3 of the past 4 weeks. Kind of gets some handoffs on end arounds as well, so he's been actively involved for the Wolverines. He's only 4.8K on FanDuel. I think he's 3.6K on DraftKings, so a couple cheapies to round out your lineup there. And I also like Ridley of Alabama. He's had 7+ receptions in the past 5 games. Hasn't found the end zone recently, but I mean, I think Derrick Henry's going to open things up for that passing game, and this could be the week where he catches one off of play action. Just seeing all the targets go his way in the Alabama passing game is pretty promising. So Calvin Ridley at 5K on FanDuel is another wide receiver that I like.
All right, got him down the list there. Tight ends, biggest price tag we've seen for one yet. Jalen Samuels for NC State. So $5,600, like you mentioned, seems outrageous. Tell me why we should play Jalen Samuels at that price.
Well, he's basically a tight end, a solid wide receiver, and a running back all mixed into one. And he has way more upside than any other tight end within this slate. And then on top of that, as I've been saying this whole podcast, there's a lot of value to go around. So you can reasonably fit him in and like the rest of your team. I mean, if this was a traditional week when we didn't have a ton of value going around, I would say absolutely not. Maybe tournament only if you're taking a chance on some cheap wide receivers. But, I mean, you can actually fit him into cash games this week. So I like him here. The matchup against Florida State looks a little bit tough. But as we said earlier, they gave up some touchdowns to Clemson's running back last week in Gallman. Samuels gets his number called with some handoffs, end arounds down by the goal line. So I think he could score on the ground again. They'll likely need him as a safety valve in the passing game. He had 7 receptions last week as well. They like to dump it to him and just try and let him run after the catch. So I think he's a very solid option despite that huge price point.
Okay. All right. And then a couple other guys here. Jordan Leggett is another one here. A cheaper price tag, but we've seen this guy also have a couple big games before as well. So is Samuels the guy you're playing for the most part in cash games, or are you going to go to Leggett a little bit here also?
I think this is definitely the week where I'm going to play a couple of cash game lineups, and it'll probably be one with Samuels, one with Leggett, and there's another guy I'm kind of looking at too. It just kind of depends on pricing from there, but I like Leggett. I think the probability of him getting close to 10 fantasy points is relatively high compared to the other tight ends, but you're not really paying for upside here because I think 10 fantasy points is right around where he's capped. I don't think there's a ton to go beyond that. So, I mean, you're paying mostly for security, not for upside. I just want to kind of, mention that because there is a little bit of a cheaper guy or a couple cheaper guys that could give you the similar total or maybe even more upside for less.
Okay, and I'm sure one of those guys is Cody Cole here, Arizona State, $2,700. And he's nice and cheap, but it seems like you like the matchup and his potential in this one.
Yeah, I think this is one of those where the matchup kind of looks tough for him, but it actually might funnel more targets his way because Washington has a solid defense. They have solid cornerbacks. So Berkovecki, the quarterback for Arizona State, might look to Cole a little bit more as his safety valve in that, and especially if the run game doesn't get going, they'll rely on that short passing game to kind of creep the defense up and then look for the bomb after that. So I like Cody Cole. He has shown upside in the past. I think this is another one of those games where he could get his number called. And then the other cheapie, or similar, semi-cheapie, I should say, is Gaines of SMU. That's a FanDuel only play. He's kind of coming around. It's either him or Sutton that's heavily involved in this passing game for SMU, and they should be throwing the ball quite a bit as they're trailing almost in every game. But I like him. He's come close to 10 fantasy points over the past 3 weeks. Pretty solid production, especially if the defenses are keen on Sutton on the outside. So I think he has a pretty decent chance at reaching the end zone this week.
Yeah, all right. I like that. That'll wrap things up for us here for this week. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got a lot of other great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.